The family needs to be destroyed. Seriously, the family unit, as we all know it, considered to be the cornerstone of society, is a defunct and, I dare say, evil institution that will most likely be replaced sooner than you think. By what, though? What am I blabbering on about? How can anyone call the family evil? Isn't the family the sacred, the single unshakable thing that nobody can take away from you? Your parents and your siblings above all else. And then the family you may choose to create yourself by having children with a partner of your choice. Who would dare mess with the single most important thing to every human being from the moment they're born? Well, not me. Someone already did. And they messed it up real hard a long time ago. And after watching this video, I'm sure we'll agree that it is indeed in dire need of being replaced. But before we come to the actual reason as to why the family as we know it needs to be destroyed and replaced, there's one crucial thing that we need to clear up. Namely, that the concept of the family unit hasn't always been the same and has changed drastically throughout human history. And how do we know this? Well, observations of Iroquois and Hawaiian tribal relations by anthropologist Lewis Henry Morgan in the 18th century unequivocally prove the existence of antiquated forms of family organization, which, in the quote-unquote civilized world, went extinct centuries ago, but remain preserved like a fossil in these isolated communities. This proved itself to be a unique opportunity to quite literally look into the past and gain anthropological insights that can have huge implications for our understanding of human society and its future. Namely, what Morgan found was the existence of ossified systems of kinship that were inherited from even older family forms, and still observable in the linguistics of those tribes, which have outgrown them, but also the seeds of the monogamous family form, which they haven't achieved just yet. This allowed him to essentially reconstruct several antiquated forms of marriage that were unrecognizable from anything we have today, and which directly disprove the myth of the eternal family unit, often propagated by conservative and religious groups. His insights show us no less than the evolution of the family unit across different socioeconomic systems, through tribal society, then slavery, feudalism, and capitalism. The family, says Morgan, represents an active principle. It is never stationary, but advances from a lower to a higher form as society advances from a lower to a higher condition. This means that what we understand as family today is only the most recent variant and may not be the final form. It will most definitely be subject to change as our socioeconomic conditions do, and in this video we'll take a look at how that might happen, regardless of whether or not YouTube decides to demonetize or geo-restrict it, as it has happened a couple of times on this channel with controversial topics. But don't worry, because in case that ever happens, Surfshark VPN, the sponsor of today's video, has a solution for you. Surfshark not only allows you to safely browse the internet by protecting your privacy and hiding your IP address, but also helps you bypass all of Netflix's geo-restrictions and watch content that may be otherwise unavailable in your country. And if there's something that sounds even better than bypassing restrictions, then that's changing your device's location and getting cheaper prices for plane tickets, hotel rooms, online stores, subscription services, you name it. And if that wasn't enough, you'll also get their extra subscription pack Surfshark One, which has even more awesome features like Surfshark Alert, which helps you stay informed about who might be using or stealing your online data in real time. So make sure to grab their special offer and protect your privacy with Surfshark VPN with up to 4 months of free access with the code BalkanOdyssey and the link in the description. And don't let predatory pricing or geo-restrictions prevent you from enjoying the things you like. Thank you to Surfshark for sponsoring, and now back to the video. So how did these socioeconomic upheavals affect the family in the past then? Well, as Friedrich Engels reconstructed Morgan's findings in his work Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, and put them within the context of broader socioeconomics, he unveiled 5 distinct family forms hiding in the distant past. He named these the primeval condition, the consanguine family, the punaluan family, the pairing family, and the monogamous family, each corresponding to a specific degree of human development. As Engels writes, reconstructing thus the past history of the family, Morgan, in agreement with most of his colleagues, arrives at a primitive stage when unrestricted sexual freedom prevailed within the tribe, every woman belonging equally to every man, and every man to every woman. In this most ancient evolutionary stage, where human relations were closer to those of animals, their children also belonged to the entire community, with no clearly discernible lineage, and unrestricted intercourse in the form of incest was a completely normal occurrence. Then, gradually arising from this initial stage, the consanguine family slowly developed. Here, the marriage groups are separated according to generations. All the grandfathers and grandmothers, within the limits of the family, are all husbands and wives of one another. So are also their children, the fathers and mothers. The latter's children will form a third circle of common husbands and wives, and their children, the great-grandchildren of the first group, will form a fourth. In this form of marriage, therefore, only ancestors and progeny, and parents and children, are excluded from the rights and duties, as we should say, of marriage with one another. Brothers and sisters, male and female cousins of the first, second, and more remote degrees, are all brothers and sisters of one another, and precisely for that reason, they're all husbands and wives of one another. As he then explains, the consanguine family is extinct. Even the most primitive peoples known to history prove no demonstrable instance of it. But that it must have existed, we are compelled to admit. For the Hawaiian system of consanguinity, still prevalent today throughout the whole of Polynesia, expresses degrees of consanguinity which could arise only in this form of family, and the whole subsequent development of the family presupposes the existence of the consanguine family as a necessary preparatory stage. Then Engels moves on to the next stage. If the first advance in organization consisted in the exclusion of parents and children from sexual intercourse with one another, the second was the exclusion of sister and brother. From a few isolated cases, this trend gradually became a general rule. There can be no question that the tribes among whom inbreeding was restricted by this advance were bound to develop more quickly and more fully than those among whom marriage between brothers and sisters remained the rule and the law. Then, the original tribe would split into two marriage classes, within which sexual intercourse was strictly prohibited. Men and women between the two tribes, however, mutually belonged to each other by birth and were husbands and wives. Women being literally abducted by men of the other class was, believe it or not, the first step in the transition towards the monogamy of today. When the young man has captured or abducted a girl, with the help of his friends, she is enjoyed by all of them in turn, but afterwards she is regarded as the wife of the young man who instigated her capture. If, on the other hand, the captured woman runs away from her husband and is caught by another man, she becomes his wife, and the first husband loses his rights. Thus, while group marriage continues to exist as a general form, side by side with group marriage, and within it, exclusive relationships begin to form, pairings of a longer and shorter period, also polygyny. At this stage, there is nonetheless one defining feature which stands in stark contrast to the monogamous family of today. In all forms of group family, it is uncertain who is the father of a child, but it is certain who the mother is. It is therefore clear that insofar as group marriage prevails, descent can only be proved on the mother's side, and that therefore only the female lineage is recognized. And this is in fact the case among all peoples in the period of savagery or in the lower stage of barbarism. Moreover, among all savages and barbarians of the lower and middle stages, sometimes even of the higher stage, women not only have freedom, but are held in high esteem. What seems so strange to the civilized man is simply the rule of maternal law and group marriage. So, as time went by, incestual prohibitions became stricter and stricter through what Morgan and Engels both describe as a manifestation of natural selection. The increasing complication of these prohibitions made group marriage more and more impossible. They were displaced by the pairing family. In this stage, one man lives with one woman, but the relationship is such that polygamy and occasional infidelity remain the right of the men, even though for economic reason polygamy is rare, while for the woman the strictest fidelity is generally demanded throughout the time she lives with the man, and adultery on her part is cruelly punished. The marriage tie can, however, be easily dissolved by either partner. After separation, the children still belong, as before, to the mother alone. So, even though men continued with their infidelity as if they were still in group marriage, the then prevailing household communism implies supremacy of women in the house as surely as exclusive recognition of natural mother and the consequent impossibility of identifying a natural father signify high esteem for women, i.e. mothers. So, according to mother right, children could not inherit from their father because they did not belong to his gens, within which his property had to remain. They belonged to their mother's gens and thus inherited property according to maternal lineage. So, it's one of the most absurd notions derived from 18th century Enlightenment that in the beginning of society, woman was the slave of man. In fact, these forms of marriage signify the period in history in which women enjoyed the most freedom, socially and economically, but not for long. In describing the catalyst of one final historical change in the family structure, he writes, "In the pairing family, the group was already reduced to its last unit, the biatomic molecule, one man and one woman. Natural selection had accomplished its purpose by continually increasing restriction of sexual intercourse. Nothing remained to be done in this direction. Unless new social forces became active, there was no reason why a new form of the family should develop out of the pairing family. But these forces did become active. Above all, the domestication of animals and the advent of cattle breeding, metalworking and weaving, as well as advances in agriculture, had developed a hitherto unknown source of wealth and created entirely new social conditions. For the first time in history, significant surplus had appeared in production. Surplus which wasn't needed to maintain bare existence, but could be used to leverage social and political power by a small number of men who first bore the fruits of the surplus and accumulated it as their private property. With these new material conditions, the character and purpose of war also changed entirely. In warfare of previous tribal societies, the men were killed or adopted as brothers into the tribe of their victors. The women were taken as wives or otherwise adopted with their surviving children. At this stage, human labor power still does not produce any considerable surplus over and above its maintenance costs. But now, with all of those socioeconomic advances, things have changed dramatically. Enemies captured in war, or more precisely, their labor power, could now be made use of in the business of cattle breeding and agriculture by this newly developing class of slave owners, which was exclusively comprised of wealthy men. Thus, slavery as a totally natural development of the new conditions morphed into an entirely new socioeconomic system based on endless warfare and utilization of slave labor by a ruling class. But why was this new ruling class comprised exclusively by men? Well, if we look back at the family of this stage, we see clearly why this broader societal shift inevitably brought a dramatic deterioration of the position of women. It all boils down to one simple rule inherited from tribal society. According to the division of labor within the family at the time, it was the man's part to obtain food and the instruments of labor necessary for the purpose. He therefore also owned the instruments of labor, and in the event of husband and wife separating, he took them with him, just as she retained her household goods. Therefore, according to the social custom of the time, the man was also the owner of the new source of subsistence, the cattle, and later of the new instruments of labor, the slaves. This private property thus became the basis of male dominance, which lasts up until this very day. But crucially, according to the custom of the same society, his children could not inherit from him. Thus, on the one hand, in proportion as wealth increased, it made the man's position in the family more important than the woman's, and on the other hand, created an impulse to exploit this strengthened position in order to overthrow, in favor of his children, the traditional order of inheritance. This, however, was impossible as long as descent was reckoned according to mother right. Maternal law, therefore, had to be overthrown, and overthrown it was. And this was by no means so difficult as it looks to us today. For this revolution, one of the most decisive ever experienced by humanity, could take place without disturbing a single of the living members of the gens. All could remain as they were. A simple decree sufficed that in the future, the offspring of the male members should remain within the gens, but that of the female should be excluded by being transferred to the gens of their father. This small change should seem familiar to any woman today that ended up changing her surname to that of her husband's, and therefore being formally and literally transferred to the husband's family. This is where it all started. This abolished the tracing of descent by female lineage and the maternal right of inheritance, and instituted descent by male lineage and the paternal right of inheritance. The overthrow of maternal law was the world historical defeat of the female sex. The man took command in the home also. The woman was degraded and reduced to servitude. She became the slave of his lust and a mere instrument for the production of children. As Engels timelessly explains, the establishment of the exclusive supremacy of the man shows its effects first in the patriarchal family, which now emerges as an intermediate form. Its essential characteristic is the organization of a number of persons, bond and free, into a family under paternal power, for the purpose of holding lands and for the care of flocks and herds. As Morgan writes, those held in servitude and those employed as servants lived in the marriage relation. This, of course, coincides entirely with Karl Marx's conclusion that the modern family contains in germ not only slavery, servitus, but also serfdom, since from the beginning it is related to agricultural services. It contains in miniature all of the contradictions which later extend throughout society and its state. And if none of this was proof enough, in Latin, famulus means domestic slave, and familia is the total number of slaves belonging to one man. As Engels observes, such a form of family shows the transition of the pairing family to monogamy. In order to make certain of the wife's fidelity, and therefore of the paternity of her children, she is delivered over unconditionally into the power of the husband. If he kills her, he is only exercising his rights. And these, ladies and gentlemen, are the historical origins of modern marriage we all know and love. From the very beginning, it is based on the supremacy of the man, the express purpose being to produce children of undisputed paternity. It is distinguished from pairing marriage by the much greater strength of the marriage tie, which can no longer be dissolved at either partner's wish. As a rule, it is now only the man who can dissolve it and put away his wife. But to her husband, she's after all nothing but the mother of his legitimate children and heirs, his chief housekeeper and the supervisor of his female slaves, whom he can and does take as concubines if he so fancies. More broadly, unbridled and shameless prostitution and adultery remain the exclusive right of the man. This was, of course, prevalent because marriage was not in any way the fruit of individual sex love, with which it had nothing whatever to do. Marriages remained as before, marriages of convenience. It was the first form of the family to be based not on natural, but on economic conditions, on the victory of private property over primitive, natural communal property. The family became, as Engels puts it, the economic unit of society. Thus, when monogamous marriage first makes its appearance in history, it is not as the reconciliation of man and woman, still less as the highest form of such a reconciliation. Quite the contrary. Monogamous marriage comes on the scene as the subjugation of the one sex by the other. It announces a struggle between the sexes unknown throughout the whole previous prehistoric period. In their 1846 manuscript, The German Ideology, one may find the following words written by Marx and Engels. The first division of labor is that between man and woman for the propagation of children. And sometime later, Engels adds how the first class opposition that appears in history coincides with the development of the antagonism between man and woman in monogamous marriage, and the first class oppression coincides with that of the female sex by the male. Monogamous marriage was a great historical step forward. Nevertheless, together with slavery and private wealth, it opens a period that has lasted until today, in which every step forward is also relatively a step backward, in which prosperity and development for some is won through the misery and frustration of others. Thus, we inevitably come to the conclusion that the modern individual family is founded on the open or concealed domestic slavery of the wife, and modern society is a mass comprised of these individual families as its molecules. But wait a minute. Sure, all of this might be historically accurate and all, but this role and power of the man in the average household does seem slightly exaggerated, doesn't it? I mean, sure, we are all aware of traditional gender roles, men being the breadwinners and whatnot, but where exactly is this supposedly immense wealth that men have accrued since the advent of the pairing marriage, as the expression of their domination? There sure isn't a lot of it in your average working class household in the 21st century, now is there? Well, see, that's exactly the catch. As in all areas of life, class society and its laws have, ever since the advent of slavery, which we previously glossed over, governed societal relations in very contradictory ways. And contradictions between the ruling and working class also had their expression in their very different experiences with the family unit. As is well known, among ruling classes of slave and feudal society throughout history, matrimony remained what it had been since the pairing marriage, a matter of convenience which was arranged by the parents. We're all aware of the phenomena of royal marriages and arranged marriages between nobles and aristocrats of all stripes. Actual attraction, partnership, and love weren't allowed to play any role in the intrigues of royal courts and state alliances. Material interests, class interests, were the very essence of their union. Love relationships, in the modern sense, only occur in antiquity outside of official society. If there were any real love affairs between free men and free women, these occurred only in the course of adultery. Essentially, monogamy here expressed itself in its purest form, as a legal guarantee that wealth and land would be inherited within the male lineage of a certain family. It then should be no surprise that there are about a dozen families in each country locally, and barely a dozen in the world in its totality, that govern everything there is. With the Industrial Revolution and rapid expansion of capitalism, maintaining private property rights became, fascinatingly enough, even more important and prevalent. As the ruling classes of all previous socioeconomic systems, the bourgeois class of today is the one that has shaped the judicial system that we all take at face value, purely according to their own interests, to defend their property rights. Their dealings amongst each other and in relation to the working class were the basis for all marital and inheritance laws and traditions we are left with today. And how do we know this? Well, as soon as we look at the economic basis and social relations of the average working class marriage, it becomes clear that the vast majority of prevailing laws are irrelevant for us. Here, there is no private property, for the preservation and inheritance of which monogamy and male supremacy were established. Hence, there is no incentive to make this male supremacy effective. The only property that remains in question would be personal property, such as the occasional house or car, which is pathetic in comparison with the billions worth of factories, equipment, and tracts of land that the ruling class keeps as private property. The law costs money, and on account of the worker's poverty, it has no validity for his relation to his wife. Here, other personal and societal conditions decide. And now that large-scale industry has taken the wife out of the home onto the labor market and into the factory, and made her often the breadwinner of the family, no basis for any kind of male supremacy is left in the proletarian household, except perhaps for something of the brutality towards women that has spread since the introduction of monogamy. So, as we can see, none of the initial reasons for the existence of the monogamous marriage, that being the inheritance of private property, are relevant for the vast majority of people, for the 99%. In short, proletarian marriage is monogamous in the etymological sense of the word, but not at all in its historical sense. So, although men and women may be technically equal before the law nowadays, after centuries of struggle of women to gain even the most basic liberties, such as the right to own property, to file a divorce, to vote, to get an abortion, to attend school, to move residences, or even have a bank account without her husband's permission, all of which came terrifyingly recently, there are many social and economic factors still preventing the full emancipation of women. Nonetheless, the arrival of capitalist industry in the 18th century opened up the road to social production for the peasant woman by turning her into a proletarian. She could now earn for her own sustenance without being confined to the house while relying on her husband's income. But it was opened in such a manner that if she carries out her duties in the private service of her family, she remains excluded from public production and unable to earn. And if she wants to take part in public production and earn independently, she cannot carry out family duties. And the wife's position in the factory is the position of women in all branches of business, right up to medicine and the law. Just ask any woman how exhausting and challenging it is to manage a career while having children. One link in the chain will inevitably have to suffer: the marriage, the career, the children, or in the last instance, she herself. This very contradiction is unavoidable and insurmountable under the current fossilized shell of monogamous patriarchal marriage, and by extension under the prevailing socioeconomic framework. They, in tandem, prevent the full and final emancipation of women, and by extension, all of society. Capitalism may have offered women emancipation, but only insofar as they could now become cogs in the same machine alongside their husbands, with the additional burden of nature in the form of child-rearing, which became completely neglected in the name of profit and endless economic growth. So it wasn't feminists that made women's lives worse by insisting on opening up the labor market to them and giving them careers, but capitalism as the system which offered them a Mephistophelian contract that bound them between two fires, neither of which they can escape. Contemporary clashes between feminists and reactionary incels and misogynists, increasing intolerance between men and women expressed through crazy divorce rates and the avoidance of marriage altogether, and the general crisis of masculinity are perfectly explained by these insurmountable contradictions imposed by the confines of the capitalist mode of production. However, as Engels optimistically concludes, we are now approaching a social revolution, in which the economic foundations of monogamy, as they have existed hitherto, will disappear, just as surely as those of its complement, prostitution. Monogamy arose from the concentration of considerable wealth into the hands of a single individual, a man, and from the need to bequeath this wealth to the children of that man and of no other. But by transforming by far the greater portion, at any rate, of permanent, heritable wealth, the means of production, into social property, the coming social revolution will reduce to a minimum all of this anxiety about bequeathing and inheriting. Having arisen from economic causes, will monogamy then disappear when these causes disappear? One might answer, not without reason, far from disappearing. It will, on the contrary, be realized completely. For with the transformation of the means of production into social property, there will also disappear wage labor, the proletariat, and therefore the necessity for a certain, statistically calculable number of women to surrender themselves for money. Prostitution disappears. Monogamy, instead of collapsing, at last becomes a reality, also for men. In any case, therefore, the position of men will very much be altered, but the position of women, of all women, also undergoes significant change. With the transfer of the means of production into common ownership, the single family ceases to be the economic unit of society. Private housekeeping is transformed into a social industry. The care and education of children becomes a public affair. Society looks after all children alike, whether they are legitimate or not. This removes all of the anxiety about quote-unquote consequences, which today is the most essential social, moral, as well as economic factor that prevents a girl from giving herself completely to the man she loves. Full freedom of marriage can therefore only be generally established when the abolition of capitalist production and the property rights created by it has removed all the accompanying economic considerations, which still exert such a powerful influence on the choice of a marriage partner. For then, there is no other motive left except mutual inclination. But what might be different or new in this future form of marriage that we are yet to discover? That will be answered when a new generation has grown up. A generation of men who never in their lives have known what it is to buy a woman's surrender with money or any other social instrument of power. A generation of women who have never known what it is to give themselves to a man from any other considerations than real love, or to refuse to give themselves to their lover from fear of economic consequences. Thank you for watching, and thank you again to Surfshark for sponsoring this video. Don't forget to check out their special offer with the link in the description and get up to 4 months of free access to all of Surfshark's features. Have fun and stay tuned.